Good day, strategy gamers, and welcome to another episode of GMT Games Downfall, Conquest of the Third Reich. This is going to be a first impressions video. It's not meant to be a comprehensive review, but rather after my first hours spent learning and getting into the game, what has my reaction been so far? Really want to start with the high level reaction of it's great. I really enjoy this game. Looking back at 2023, this certainly would rank up there as one of the better games, if not top 3 games that I've played in 2023. And I'm really looking forward to spending more time with it in the next year. It's at a good scale. It's easily approachable. It's quick to set up. It doesn't take up a lot of space. It's all around rather balanced and has some novel concepts that I really enjoy. When we look at the setup, it's something that you can really get into, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 minutes to get everything set up from beginning to end. I would even argue that when you open up the box and if you just immediately put out the maps and took the setup aids, started punching counters and putting them directly onto the map, you could probably get going in about half an hour. I mean, it's very easy to jump right into, I feel. Speaking of the play aids, they're top-notch. Really, really enjoy them and kind of put them into 2 different buckets. First would be play aids regarding turn-by-turn interactions, and we'll start with just this one. And we mentioned these in the unboxing video, but just want to highlight them here. You have an order sheet, details every order that's available to your factions, with the initiative cost and a brief description, but the visual aid helps so much too in understanding what the counter looks like on the map. Flip side is for the other factions or for the other player aid. We have 2 of these in the box. But then there's this player aid, which may be the best of the lot. It's a 1-pager that just documents everything that's needed to know for combat. I don't think that in my time playing so far, I've actually had to go to the rule book for any combat situation. I think pretty much every instance I've been able to just use this 1-pager. Documents the sequence of combat, the steps you need to take, any modifiers from strength or dice roll modifiers, and then of course your resolution table. It's straightforward. It's not too simple, not too complex. It's a good balance. Also has a nice little chart about naval interception and sea attacks. On the other side, just some common concepts and guides for you around parts of the game, supply, zones of control, etc. Nice having this handy. And then everything you need to know about partisans and how that order works, how to deploy them, etc., how to interact with partisans on the map. So these 2 sheets are really fantastic. Then we also have, and you know, I've had a lot of games that have these, but these little playing card cheat sheets, you know, it comes to mind like Churchill and such. They'll come with these, and generally I don't find myself using them. In this game, these have been just very useful and they're very concise, and maybe I don't know why I've been drawn to them specifically, but I've been using them just kind of as I've gotten into the game. One side talks about initiative costs because it's not always as straightforward as just what's listed on the order track. There's sometimes some modifiers to the initiative cost, and this documents all those situations. When you get to the end of a turn and you're moving into a new turn, what are all the steps needed to complete that? And then on the flip sides, you have everything needed for an action round in order, what you need to do, and then event procedure, everything in order, what you need to do. Most of the time, when I get a new game, I'm the type that will sit down and try to read the rule book. I know that's not for everyone, but it is generally how I approach most games. I like to just sit down and really try to absorb everything in the rule book, then start pushing counters around on the map. This game, I read maybe 25% of the rule book, but everything was really clicking with me as I was reading through, and I thought, let's actually just try jump right into it. I then just picked up these cards and these play sheets that I mentioned and really was able to just go from there. And maybe every 20 to 30 minutes, I would look up one nuanced thing in the rule book or something like that. But it's not a situation where I felt like I had to read the full rule book. These play aids really get you through most of the mechanics in the game. Last, just want to touch on it. It's more so for setup, but just on that note, there are these setup aids, and again, they're all visual, matching perfectly to the counter, where it goes on the map. You can take this right out of the box and get it set up so easily because you have one of these for every faction, for every scenario that the game comes with. So, well done there. In terms of the time that I've spent with the game, like I mentioned, these are my first hours that I'm recording this as my very initial impressions, because I think it's good to reflect on an experience immediately after, but then also once you've had a more comprehensive look at everything it encompasses. So this is the first impression video. I have not completed a full game yet. I've spent, again, maybe a little less than 10 hours playing the game so far in total. I've done a couple of different re-racks going back to the initial setup, and it's gone very well. I haven't got stumped really by anything. There haven't been any roadblocks, let me put it that way. The pace per turn, it's a little tough to judge because, again, it's the first turns I've taken with the game. I'm probably coming in somewhere around 3 hours, maybe a little shy of that. The rule book says 2 hours is what's to expect per turn. I certainly agree with that it's probably about 2 hours. Once you've gotten into the rhythm and you're familiar with all the mechanics, I think that's a very realistic estimate. And I don't think that every game would necessarily need to go to turn 8 either. So that does not inherently mean that every game needs to take, say, 16 hours. And some turns, I'm pretty sure here, are going to go faster than others just based off the different events that are happening. The next two sections I want to talk about is, what have been some of the, maybe challenges in the right word, but just surprises as I've tried to get into the game and I've tried to learn it. And then what are some key aspects that have really stood out to me that have impressed, that I really enjoy about the game so far from a first impression look. So talking about obstacles first, I want to begin with playing the game solitaire, because that's what all my experience with it so far has been, a solitaire play. Now, it has a pretty low solitaire rating on the box. I think it's recognized now by the designer and the general community that solitaire rating is probably too low. And I would agree with that. I think the solitaire rating on the box is too low and that this is a very solo-friendly game. Let me put that out there. And I do a lot of solo gaming, so it's generally my preference when looking at new games. But I think this is a very solitaire-friendly game. That said, there was a surprise for me as I started to play it solitaire. I think in most war games and hex and counter games that we're used to, when you're playing solitaire, it's a pretty consistent dynamic that ends up happening. And, let's take the generic East Front game that maybe you play, and we'll pick on an example of maybe the Third Winter from the OCS series, right? And, okay, you've got the map out of Ukraine, and the Soviet forces are trying to advance from the east to the west, and then the second player, the Axis forces, are trying to defend against those advances. And you take turns going back and forth, defending and trying to advance through Ukraine. That's a pretty consistent theme that exists in so many games in our hobby, of just two players back and forth fighting along a front. And I think many of us have probably become a little wired to handling that type of solitaire play where it's almost binary of the two sides. Downfall, what surprised me is it is a two-player game, but because there's 4 factions, it can feel just a little different. There's 4 factions, and there's also not a very clear I go, you go turn structure. There's an initiative track that dictates turns. So the pace and which faction you're playing at adds a little bit more complexity. A lot of times while I was playing in my initial hours with the game, I actually felt more like I was playing a 4-player game than I did a 2-player game. Now again, still very manageable. That's nothing that should scare you about playing this game solitaire. But I just had to step back for a second and really think about that concept, that it's not as straightforward as a lot of solitaire play that I've historically been used to. that it's just a little more nuanced because you're the Soviet player and you're trying to rush towards Germany. You're going east to west as quickly as you can, surrounding units, trying to break through. And that's one mindset that you have as the Soviet player. But also as the Soviet player, you're sitting there going, how quickly can I get the 5th Panzer out of North Africa before the Allies destroy that unit, or it has a supply check that goes wrong, or what have you. So it was just a little bit more complexity than I'd first thought on how I process that, because both considerations, you're normally thinking about that from one player's perspective, but you have to kind of join that together. I think one thing that helped as I started to play was I actually did sometimes get up, and when I was playing as the Soviet or OKW side, I would actually start to get out of my chair a little bit more frequently to look from that perspective, and I think that helped a little bit too. But it was just something that surprised me. I still rate this, though, very, very highly as a solitaire game from my first impressions. The next is Zone of Control mechanics. I have nothing against the mechanic. I think it's well done. This comment is not to complain about the mechanic itself. More so just that my first impressions have been the Zone of Control's mechanics feel very different to me than the other games that I'm used to playing. Now, that could just be the own bias in the collection that I play of board games, but it just felt a little different with how the hex spines through the Zone of Control still apply, even if you have a unit in the neighboring hex you're trying to move into. And if I had to pick just one area where I made the most rules mistakes when I was getting into this game, it was definitely the Zone of Control mechanics. So if you're just starting out, that section of the rulebook, it's just a couple of paragraphs, it's not too long. I'd recommend reading that just a couple of times to really make sure that sinks in for you about Zone of Control. At least it gave me a little bit of a challenge. The next is the strategic warfare boxes, which we have the strategic bombing box, Battle of the Atlantic, and the Siege of Malta, strategic warfare areas. You know, having read in the rule book about them and heard from the community about kind of different playthroughs of the game, after actions, etc., I really like the concept and what they're trying to do with them. But I have to admit that my first impression would sit here and say, in turn 1, maybe a little bit into turn 2, I don't feel as a player strongly compelled to engage with them that much. Maybe that will change. Maybe that will, as I get deeper into the games, I'll realize their value more in the late game. Or maybe as I play opposed opponents, they'll pick out their practicality more easily than I can right now solitaire. So it's just something that I want to call out. It hasn't felt from turn 1 as something that I really feel compelled to engage in. I'm looking forward to engaging them more and seeing how it plays out when I complete a couple of full game playthroughs, etc. But that was just something that just kind of surprised me because it's such an interesting concept that's core to the game. It's large on the map in these 3 different areas, etc. Yet from my perspective as a player, I wasn't sitting here thinking about decision making and feeling like, oh, I'm falling behind in the Battle of Atlantic. I have to do something there. So we'll see how that plays out. Last, this is a very small comment, but I just want to point it out. And this is going to be common across any game of this specific theater time period representation. And that is early game, naturally. Almost all the very exciting actions happening on the East Front with the Soviets and OKH. Really nothing you can do about that when you're trying to represent this time period in a game. North Africa, sure, there's some stuff going on for the Western Allies, but really you just kind of sit there and envy, right, as the East Front sees so much ground combat action and decision making. Not to say that there aren't things for the Western Allies to do or for OKW to do. It's just, it feels a little bit like they get a lot of the fun in the early game, but I'm sure that corrects itself once the Western Allies get more and more involved in Western Europe. A couple of topics that I really just love from my first hours with the game. The first is just the agency that the player has in decision making. So this is obviously a strategic level game, and it's over a massive sized theater, right? It fits on 2 map sheets, but really there is a lot trying to be encompassed here, from the East Front to Africa to the Italian peninsula, where you're going to invade in France. It even represents some of the Norwegian areas of the war. But you feel a great sense of agency in being able to do things that aren't a perfect representation of the historical outcomes. Now, I'll give one very specific example of that. The game starts on the East Front with the Soviets about to break through and really cut off Stalingrad completely, which will see the elimination of a number of Axis forces, right? And you're primed and you're ready to complete that maneuver. But in one of my playthroughs, I sat there and thought, well, at the time, I had available to me a recruit order sitting very low there on my action track, and thought, a lot of my forces as the Soviet player are really depleted. And a criticism sometimes that's been leveled to the Soviet forces in World War II was, they never gave themselves really the time they probably should have to prepare for larger offensives. They were always just pushing nonstop at an incredible pace. Now that has its benefits as well, certainly from a strategic perspective, but it was a slightly different approach from, say, the Western Allies, where there'd be maybe more preparation and you'd make sure your forces were in a certain order before you actually launched an attack, right? So I thought, well, let's give this a try. Let's reinforce for my infantry-based units, build up their strength a little bit, and that'll give me more opportunity maybe to break through the German lines. And in that playthrough, there wasn't anything that indicated to me that, I'd lost in turn 1, the East Front. It actually did seem to work out moderately well. And those are small decisions that really give you a feeling of empowerment as the player to make decisions that impact the ultimate course of events here. And then seeing how OKH responds to that as well is very interesting, because those were not the historical circumstances either. Then the question begins, do we try to counterattack as OKH and hold Stalingrad a little bit longer, or do we take this opportunity to retreat from the city, right? There's so much then that compounds after that one decision of what the players are going to be making. But at the end of the day, despite that agency, you still have very historical turns of events, I feel, right? Map is clearly designed in a way where, you're not going to go from Egypt up through the Middle East, through Turkey, and do an invasion of Bulgaria as the Western Allies, right? The map won't even allow for such a non-historical event to happen. But you can sit here and say, when will Operation Husky occur? Am I going to concentrate more forces in North Africa for the Italian invasion? Or am I going to put more of an effort on, say, two different landings in France? I don't know, making something up. So there's a great sense of agency that you have as the player, and I've really enjoyed that so far in my time with the game. The other thing that I've loved is how the initiative track works in the orders. So the initiative track is just this wonderful, wonderful mechanic that leaves you sitting there always trying to calculate how much initiative space do I want to leave between me and the other player to then try to prevent them from, say, getting a double turn in or a double order round in, versus trying to do a whole bunch now. Well, you have the initiative, right? If you are the phasing player who has the lowest initiative, and if you have 10 initiative spots until the next player, you can sit there and go, oh boy, this is exciting. I could do maybe a redeploy and then an attack order, and that still leaves me with the initiative, and then I can squeeze in a recruit order, so that way I can reinforce in all of the areas that I just exhausted through an offensive. That's very exciting. There's a lot of thought that goes into that decision making, but then that also has consequences of that then puts me 16 initiative ahead of everybody else. So for how many phasing turns or rounds am I going to be sitting there just soaking up counterattacks from the enemy, unable to respond? So there's this fine balance of trying to land your marker in specific spots relative to your opponents to leverage areas of opportunity that might exist on the map, but also not leave yourself too vulnerable to your opponent having multiple order rounds before you get a chance to actually respond. Just so very, very well done. The other thing I want to call out is just the combat mechanics. They're straightforward. There's nothing too complex. I think even players that are newer to our hobby can easily get into how these combat mechanics work. Again, with the play aid, you can go through step by step of trying to, not trying to, but successfully calculating what the combat result will be. It's very straightforward. And I just want to commend the designers on that, because there's so much to try to capture with a game at this scale. World War II, European theater at a strategic level. I mean, you could have sat there and said, well, you know, in the first year of the war, here are the modifiers. But by the end of the war, you know, the Germans have Tiger tanks and V2 rockets, and here's how combat changes because of these types of things in the combat tables. But they've instead, I think, abstracted some of those concepts through event cards, etc., and just left combat at a good level of complexity that's easy to engage with. And I've enjoyed that, because I haven't felt like I've needed to learn a game within a game just for the combat module at the strategic level of fighting. So that's been pleasant to have something that's so approachable with a game of this scale and scope. That really wraps up some of my first impressions that I wanted to talk about for Downfall: Conquest of the Third Reich. I do want to say new videos are coming for this game. So as mentioned earlier, there will be a follow-on full review video, likely months from now, after I've had a lot more time to sink into this game and I can give more of a learned opinion on all of its benefits in game design and where I see opportunities with it. But also, I'm going to have a series that will be coming out as I go through and try to do a full playthrough, I think. So we'll do a playlist where we try to do, you know, maybe it's one turn each video. I don't know the exact format, but that'll be coming out shortly. And both those videos, if you're coming back to this video at a later date, I'll have those linked in the description or here on the video screen. So please be sure to check out those if you're interested in seeing more gameplay for Downfall. And then lastly, I do have, thanks to Santa and the holiday season, just a couple new pieces for recording equipment. So as always, if you notice anything with the production quality, sound, video, etc. that can be improved upon or you'd like to see, please let me know in the comments section. Always endeavoring to make these quality productions just ever so slightly better. And also, this is a newer medium on the channel, whereas most of the channel has historically been the PC capture of virtual war games. Now with a physical medium, it just presents some different opportunities to make the production quality really good. So always love to hear your feedback there on those matters. And if you have any questions about the game, or just, you know, thoughts on, you know, how does it play in this manner or what have you, please leave them in the comments section below, and always happy to answer those the best I can. With that, though, strategy gamers, as always, hoping you have yourselves an excellent day. Bye now.